Well, it seems like you guys like part 1, and I just gotta say thank you for watching. That video performed way better than any of my expectations. So today, we're gonna be taking a look at layer 3, and I'm not wasting any more time on this intro. Let's jump right into it. Eastern Zhou Robotics. This is referring to an incredibly curious story recorded in the Lingzhi, a Taoist text that was likely fully compiled in the 4th century AD, but whose authorship is traditionally attributed to the 5th century BC, to a man named Liu Ku, a semi-legendary Taoist philosopher from the 100 schools of thought from the Spring and Autumn period, which is understood to be the first half of the Eastern Zhou period, of 771 to 481 BC, with the second half lasting through 481 to 221 BC, which is more well known as the Warring States period. Anyway, I thought I'd clear that up, since I threw around those eras kind of interchangeably in part 1. And in the Lingzhi, one of its chapters tells the life story of King Mu of Zhou, and one story claims that while King Mu was traveling back home, he was visited by a, quote, artificier, or an engineer of some sort named Yanxi, who had somehow managed to build an extremely lifelike human automaton that could move incredibly realistically, could sing in perfect tune when tapped on the chin, and can even dance to his song when tapped on the hand. However, this ancient Chinese clanker then started macking on and risen up King Mu's concubines, winking at them and making advances on them, which pissed off King Mu, who was gonna have Yanxi executed on the spot for this highly inappropriate robot flirtation. But the king's rage put the fear of Xiongnu in Yanxi, who then began rapidly disassembling the automaton to show the king that it was just a machine made of leather, wood, adhesive, and lacquer. And when the king inspected the automaton up close, he saw that it was indeed a soulless artificial automata. But this robot wasn't just a cheap metal skeleton or some kind of wireframe, and this robot had several artificial recreations of all its internal organs: liver, gallbladder, heart, spleen, kidneys, stomach, and everything, with artificial muscles, bones, joints, tendons, teeth, hair, and skin all layered on top, holding the automaton together. King Mu then experimented with the bot, taking out its artificial heart, which then stopped the robot from speaking, and he then took out the liver, and the robot couldn't see anymore. And he then took out the kidneys, which prevented the robot from walking. And King Mu was just tickled pink by this, gleefully disemboweling this lifelike robot and watching it slowly lose all its bodily functions as he ripped its artificial organs out one by one. And pleased with the overall experience, King Mu then took Yanxi into his service to become his court engineer. And now this is a fascinating story for multiple reasons, as this robot was highly advanced for the time, as King Mu was reported to have lived in the 900s BC, and this robot could walk, talk, sing, dance, and even spit some game. And it was built to mimic human anatomy down to their skin, bones, and internal organs, all of which allow the robot to perform different functions, whereas the automatons we have today, in the year of our Lord 2025, where we can harness lightning itself to make metal move in any way that we see fit, our robots are still nowhere near the robustness and complexity of this ancient Zhou automata. We got suspiciously athletic bots from Boston, but they can't sing, dance, or rizz up women. And Uncle Bot from China can mostly just run around and wave, but he does have the ability to wear clothes. And that Tesla Optimus bot is a glorified puppet on strings compared to Yanxi's automata. Those things still needed people to speak and move for them, piloting them from a remote location with a bunch of sensors hooked up to a real living human. And now this is just a mythological Taoist story though, and I highly doubt a humanoid robot from the 900s BC with almost perfect recreations of human guts inside of it was ever truly crafted, as King Mu's life story is highly mythological and unbelievable just beyond this incredibly advanced robot. He wines and dines with the gods themselves like the Queen Mother of the West, while in search of Taoist peaches of immortality. But it's still a fascinating story to hear about and try to picture in your head. And it just goes to show how long humans have been fascinated with robotics and machinery. Chinese cannibalism. Across China's long and storied history, the practice of cannibalism, unfortunately, shows up many times, and for multiple different reasons. Anything from wild threats to eat people's vital organs, to mass human meat barbecues driven by extreme lack of food during wartime. In traditional Chinese histories, it was fairly common for people to issue threats to tear out, or even straight up devour another person's liver or heart as a form of extreme vengeance, or as the ultimate act of disrespect and desecration of your most hated foes and ops. Like we see with our old pal Wang Mang. Remember how after he got bum-rushed at his palace by an angry mob, they chopped his body to pieces and his tongue was reportedly later cut out and eaten? It's kind of the same idea here, as other accounts claim that Wang Mang had more than just his tongue eaten, and his liver may have been devoured by the angry mob as well. And if you hated somebody enough in ancient China, there's no better way to show that hatred than to eat a part of their corpse, which is fair as far as hatred goes. It takes some next level hating to just go beyond mutilating or pissing on a corpse or something, and actually devouring a part of it. It shows you care. And another form of cannibalism comes from traditional Chinese medicinal and Confucian beliefs, as traditional Chinese medicine believes that the human body has many health benefits when consumed, which is in line with Taoist-influenced beliefs of Jing, or essence, essentially your bodily energy, which every human is born with a certain amount of, which can be lost over time, thanks to the challenges and stresses of everyday life. However, in traditional Chinese medicine, it's believed that Jing can be restored in a few ways, and one of the ways it can be restored is through consuming human body parts that are rich in Jing. Traditional Chinese medicine books like the Benxiao Shi Yi from 1597, it describes 35 different types of human body-derived drugs, made of anything to and from human hair, fingernails, tears, saliva, shit, piss, sweat, dandruff, pubic hair, placenta, bones, penis meat, kidney stones, bregma, which is the part of the skull where the coronal and sagittal sutures intersect, human ghost, or the souls of killed criminals, and of course, good old human flesh, and plenty of more drugs. And as for some Confucian cannibalism, official dynastic histories reportedly show 110 different examples of, quote, voluntary flesh offerings, wherein the ultimate display of filial piety, young members of a family, which were usually daughters-in-laws, will cut off a chunk of their own flesh, usually off the upper arm or the thigh, which would then be mixed into a soup for a sick old family member to consume. These offerings being recorded from the 7th century all the way to the 20th century, as it was believed that the flesh of young adults and adolescents was extra rich in Jing and had solid, life-extending properties when consumed. And this belief was on full display when Buddhism's #1 hater, Emperor Wuzhong of Tang, had fallen seriously ill, where according to some traditional accounts, in a desperate attempt to cure himself and extend his life, Wuzhong had allegedly requested provincial lords to send him the livers and hearts of 15-year-olds for him to eat, which didn't work. Shocking. And the reason he requested the hearts and livers is because in traditional Chinese medicine belief, the liver is extra rich in Jing, and the heart is considered the, quote, emperor of the body, and is rich in Shen, or spirit. So that's why you'll see lots of examples of hearts and livers being harvested and eaten in tandem. However, the most well-known forms of Chinese cannibalism usually happen during times of war or extreme food scarcity and famine. One of the most notorious examples taking place during the siege of Suyang, during the Anlushan Rebellion, and I made a whole video on this very siege, where in a desperate attempt to hold Suyang by any means necessary, Tang General Zhang Jun resorted to cannibalism after food supplies in and around the city had completely dried up, with it being believed that anywhere from 20 to 30,000 civilians and soldiers may have been eaten to keep Zhen's army fed to prevent Anlushan's rebels from breaking into the fertile southwest of Tang, China. A grotesque human slaughter and barbecue session that may have actually saved the entire Tang dynasty as we knew it. And cannibalism was also widely reported during the Taiping Rebellion as well, as the desolation and destruction the rebellion brought to rural Chinese society and infrastructure forced the people and troops to resort to cannibalism and human meat markets in some places just to stay fed, as the Civil War raged on for 14 brutal years. Cannibalism also crops up during times of strife and government instability, like the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period of 907 to 979, and the chaotic transition from the Ming to the Qing dynasty. As wars and famines raged, human meat markets weren't an uncommon sight as women, children, and the weak and frail were butchered for any extra meat that they could get their hands on. And the most recent example of horrific cannibalism in Chinese history occurred during Mao's Cultural Revolution, during the infamous Guanxi Massacre, where according to reports, anywhere from 137 to over 420 people were killed, dismembered, and they were either partially or fully cannibalized, despite the fact that no famine was occurring in Guangxi at the time. They were eating human meat for the love of the game. The killing started as a conflict broke out in Guangxi province between 2 factions, the United Headquarters, the Communist Establishment faction who rallied around the leadership of a higher-ranking CCP official and the current chairman of Guangxi province, Wei Guoqing, and the 422s, a faction who did not fully support Wei Guoqing unless he did some Marxist self-criticism first. This tension eventually leading to the 422s being declared as reactionary counter-revolutionaries, effectively calling for open season on the 422s and their supporters and relatives, which caused massive violence and massacres to break out, which soon extended to the landowners and the rich of Guangxi, with experts believing that 100,000 to up to 500,000 people died in the Guangxi massacres over an almost 2-year-long reign of terror, where on top of brutal killings like beheadings, being buried alive, drownings, stonings, beatings, and even boiling people to death, many victims were also hacked to pieces and were partially or sometimes fully cannibalized, with hearts, livers, and even genitals being cut out and consumed as an ultimate form of destruction and desecration of the enemies of the Cultural Revolution, as well as some cannibal revolutionaries swearing by the health benefits of eating human body parts, resulting in some absolutely horrific stories of cannibalism coming out of Guanyin that include a middle school geography teacher named Wu Shufang being beat to death by zealous Red Guard students, who then forced another teacher to cut out her liver and heart, which the students then later barbecued and consumed at their school. Another report claims that a man named Chen Guorong was abducted and killed while traveling, and his heart, liver, and flesh were all cut off and passed around a 20-man militia to be eaten. Chen brutally killed and viciously devoured, simply because he was fat. And another report claims that on September 1st, 1968, a quote-unquote killing conference was held by the Revolutionary Committee of Shaanxi County, where 10 civilians and officials were publicly beaten to death, and their hearts and livers were then cut out to be sauteed and served to the killing conference attendants later on. What the absolute fuck? Along with plenty of other grisly and horrifying examples of people being murdered and partially eaten, that I'd rather not talk about. But yeah, as we can clearly see, China has long traditions of human meat eating in multiple different contexts, and while grotesque massacres like the Suiyang Siege and the Guangxi Massacre definitely command the most attention and horror, small medicinal forms of cannibalism were, and still are, very popular in traditional Chinese medicines even to this very day. The Chunqiu predicts the future. This refers to the Spring and Autumn Annals, an ancient Chinese classic text and the oldest surviving Chinese text to be recorded in annals format, which just means that it's a historical text that was recorded chronologically, and it's believed that the Spring and Autumn Annals was written in the 5th century BC and was traditionally believed to have been fully compiled and edited by Confucius himself. Although, like with any claim about old Master Kong's life, it's mostly just mythological speculation. And the Spring and Autumn Annals is a historical chronicle about the state of Lu from 722 to 41 BC, Confucius' home state and a vassal state of the ancient Zhou dynasty, and it records rulers, marriages, ascensions to the throne, battles, succession crises, natural disasters, and celestial phenomena that all happen in Lu's state. And the text itself is written in a very dry, terse, and matter-of-fact style, with brief entries only recording significant events with little in the way of context or elaboration. And due to this, many commentaries have been written on the Spring and Autumn Annals, which expand on not only the histories in the text, but also use the text to explain hidden philosophical lessons, cosmic portents, and secret patterns that can be used to analyze and predict the rise and fall of current leaders and states by looking at celestial and natural patterns and signs, and the effects that they have on the state of Lu in this chronicle. All of which is synergized with Confucian and Taoist beliefs and philosophies, as Confucian scholars like Mencius believe that Confucius himself edited the annals to some degree, hiding his philosophies within the brief entries of the chronicle, a belief that was widely accepted by Chinese scholars until at least the 20th century. And of the 5 major commentaries on the Spring and Autumn Annals, the Gongyang Zhuan is the one we'll be most interested in, as that commentary was written under the assumption that Confucius not only wrote the annals himself as a historical chronicle, but he also wrote it as an esoteric commentary and guideline on how to create and maintain a virtuous state through the righteous actions of its rulers and the ability to read and understand natural and cosmic omens and signs. And not only that, this commentary also assumes that due to his immense virtue and sage wisdom, Confucius had all the qualifications to become a Zhou-era king. However, due to his lowly birth status and the erratic political landscape of the time, he never received the mandate of heaven and never took his rightful place as a glorious philosopher king. Now, the annals and its commentaries don't predict the future explicitly, like a prophecy or something along those lines would. There aren't any bold assertions that X will happen in year Y, which heralds Z, or something along the lines of, in 1,000 years' time, Confucius himself shall descend back down to earth from heaven to smite the current emperor for his lack of virtuosity, or something similar. Rather, commentaries like the Gongyang and the teachings of Han Dynasty-era Confucian mystics like Dong Zhongshu explain that through analysis of the annals, those studying it will be able to read about the cosmic and natural phenomenon and the patterns recorded in the annals, and see the political events that occurred in the state of Lu before and after said phenomena, and then be able to apply it to the present-day government to predict future political developments, such as if a ruler or state may fall and be replaced soon, as natural events such as floods, earthquakes, solar eclipses, and comets were interpreted to be a sign of heaven's dissatisfaction with the current ruler or dynasty, as it's usually believed that these events occurred when a ruler was not up to heaven's moral code, whether they be too neglectful, cruel, greedy, or horny, or whatever. If a ruler, say, spent more time banging his concubines and feasting, rather than justly governing his kingdom in accordance with ideal Confucian virtues and conduct, as heaven would get fed up with his shit It would make the earth shake and have deluges sweep over the land. Or maybe it would shoot a comet across the sky, or block out the sun for a bit to try and spook the shit out of the current ruler, and teach him a lesson that his morality was some booty butt cheeks, and amends must be made, lest your mandate of heaven be lost and passed on to a more worthy ruler. And this belief in natural and cosmic phenomena being predictive signs of future political upheaval due to a degradation in Confucian virtue amongst the ruling dynasty eventually became Han Dynasty orthodoxy, and belief in cosmic or natural phenomena to signal if a ruler still has or has lost the mandate of heaven has been a mainstay in Chinese political thought and religious belief for over 2,000 years, starting from around the time when these annals and commentaries are most widely circulated. Fu Shu discovered Japan. Fu Shu, or I believe it's Shu Fu actually, was an ancient and semi-legendary Chinese alchemist and explorer who was born in 255 BC in the state of Qi, during the twilight of the Warring States period, as our favorite mausoleum enthusiast Qin Shi Huang would unite China in the year 221 BC under his new Qin dynasty. And of course, most of our info on Zhu Fu's life comes from, take a wild fucking guess. Yeah, of course, it's Sima Qian again, in his 100% factual historical opus, the Shiji. Zhu Fu was appointed as a court sorcerer for the Qin dynasty, and was eventually given a special quest by Emperor Qin Shi Huang. In 219 BC, Qin Shi Huang had tasked Zhu Fu with finding that ever-so-elusive elixir of immortality for him, which they believed could be found in the possession of immortal wizards who lived on the mythical Mount Penglai at the end of the EC, as outlined in the Shanhai Jing. To complete his task, Qin Shi Huang had given Zhu Fu a fleet of ships, craftsmen, supplies, and 3,000 virgin boys and girls as a potential offering for the immortals, and Zhu Fu set sail on the modern-day East China Sea in search of a magic potion, scouring the EC for 9 whole years, yet failing to find any elixirs of life or the location of Mount Penglai itself. And upon his return in 210 BC, the last year of Qin Shi Huang's life, a probably pretty mercury-saturated Qin Shi Huang had demanded to know why he had failed his quest, and Zhu Fu then pulled a fast one on Qin Shi Huang and lied about a giant sea monster blocking his path, and requested archers to be sent out to kill the fish monster, which Emperor QSH agreed to, and Zhu Fu then set sail again. However, this time, Zhu Fu never returned to China, and according to Sima Qian, Zhu Fu had reached a place with, quote, flat plains and wide swamps, and he proclaimed himself king of the place, and established his own kingdom using the vast amount of people and resources given him by old QSH. Zhu Fu absolutely fleecing the first emperor here. Jeez. But it's unclear where this place he made himself king of actually was though, as Qian does not elaborate further, and later chronicles claim that he settled at a place called Danzhou, but nobody, neither scholars nor historians, know where Danzhou was or is supposed to be. However, around 950 AD, during the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, a monk named Yichu had claimed that Zhu Fu had actually landed in Japan and had believed that he had found the mythical Mount Penglai in the form of Mount Fuji. And this tale soon led to traditional beliefs about Zhu Fu's landing to take root in Japan itself, with many local monuments and tombs being built to him across Japan. In some traditional Japanese histories, like the ones found in Saga City, believe that Zhu Fu had settled in Japan after following a floating cup that he put in the sea to land. And some also believe that he eventually found the elixir of immortality he sought for so long. Some hermit on a mountain in Japan had it all along, it turns out. And some Japanese folklore even claims that he may have taken a swig of the infinite life juice, and may still be alive to this very day. And these traditional historical beliefs also hold that Zhu Fu had brought new farming techniques, plants, and tools from China to Japan to help their agriculture flourish. Now, did Zhu Fu actually, quote-unquote, discover Japan and settled it, where it eventually grew into the nation that it is today? Well, short answer, no. And long answer, modern humans are believed to have lived in Japan since 38,000 BC, and distinct cultures like the Jomon had existed in Japan since 14,000 BC. So if Zhu Fu had landed in Japan around 210 BC as the traditional histories claim, he'd have found it already fairly discovered by then. And also, the sources and historical records of Zhu Fu landing explicitly in Japan aren't really solidified until well over 1,000 years after the legendary voyages would have took place, like we see with Yi Chu's claim. And the earlier sources like the Shiji and the Book of the Later Han report him landing in vaguely described or straight up unknown places like Danzhou, which I mean, could refer to Japan as we know it today, but it's completely uncertain. And it's likely a similar case to the myth that Jiji from the Shang dynasty founded Korea, existing as a way to explain and synergize cultural and historical similarities between Japan and China through a shared mythology, with Zhu Fu eventually becoming an interesting Japanese folk historical figure based on these legendary accounts and ancient histories. And I feel fairly confident in this assessment too, because honestly, I'm not sure how historically sound an account of a court wizard searching for a magical potion of immortality from 1,000-year-old immortal magicians by following mythical geography outlined in a book that has 10-bodied fish, a snake god with 9 human heads and stinky-ass blood, and like 200 different types of human-animal hybrid creatures in it really is. Hungarians descend from the Xiongnu. Bear with me on this one. Genetic lineage is definitely not my forte. But this is a theory that modern Hungarians, somewhere in their genetic history, descend from the Xiongnu people, a confederation of nomadic tribes who lived in modern-day Mongolia and Central Asia from around the 3rd century BC to the middle 1st century AD. Xiongnu, which literally means fierce slave in Chinese, are your typical northern barbarian raiders that the Chinese kept building walls to fight against, and as opposed to the settled, agricultural Han Chinese, the Xiongnu people were nomadic horse riders and steppe herders, but they were able to become a pretty serious rival to the Han dynasty after their leader, Modu Chunqiu, united the Xiongnu tribes into a united confederation in 209 BC that would last for almost 300 years. The Xiongnu would perform diplomacy, trade with, and even intermarry with the Han in the northern regions of China for political and territorial reasons. But usually, the Xiongnu and Han would just wage war against each other, fighting each other in several conflicts and wars over a 200-year-long span for the dominance of the northern frontiers of China and the steppe. The Han dynasty slowly gaining the upper hand and beating the Xiongnu back north, which was helped greatly by Han victory in the War of the Heavenly Horses in 101 BC, where Han China, in need of strong horses to defeat the Xiongnu's superior cavalry, as well as looking to expand their borders and shore up their influence westward along the Silk Road, had invaded the Daiyuan, or the Great Ionians, a remnant state of Hellenic settlers from Alexander the Great's conquests, located in the Fergana Valley in modern-day Uzbekistan. And after 2 military expeditions, the Han had forced the Daiyuan to submit to Han military power and hand over 3,000 heavenly Fergana horses to build up new powerful mounted cavalry military units. The Han Chinese believing that these horses had descended from a celestial stock of horses from heaven that could sweat blood as a sign of their divine nature, which modern historians now believe may have been due to a blood-sucking parasite that was common in these horse breeds. Well, these heavenly horses proved to be quite effective against the Xiongnu, as they were able to conquer Xiongnu lands and isolate them from other nomadic groups, weakening and seriously destabilizing their confederation, which eventually led to internal strife, usurpations, and civil war within the Xiongnu confederations, eventually splitting between northern and southern Xiongnu populations, where the southern Xiongnu eventually were assimilated into Han China over several centuries and eventually lost their Xiongnu identity. The northern Xiongnu's kept resisting, but the Han dynasty, taking advantage of the extremely weakened and isolated northern Xiongnu's, really started belt-to-assing them, eventually forcing the northern Xiongnu to flee to the northwest, where they then go on to vanish into the pages of history, never to return. The Chinese losing track of the Xiongnu around the 2nd century AD. Now this is where the theory comes into play, as some believe that these defeated Xiongnu eventually became or assimilated into the Huns, nomadic, horse-mounted warrior peoples who terrorized Eastern Europe and the Western Roman Empire, who first appeared around 370 AD. You know, Attila the Hun, sacking cities, stealing booty both metallic and fleshy, all that fun stuff. However, modern Hungarians descend from the Magyar peoples, people who originated in the Ural Mountains region back in the old 2000 BC times, and arrived in Europe around 895 AD, where they remained in the Carpathian Basin, and eventually became modern Hungarians as we know and maybe love today.
The globalists can all go to hell.
Now, it could be possible that the Hungarians are descended from the Xiongnu in some part, if a connection can be made from the Magyars to the Huns, and then the Huns to the migrating northern Xiongnu's, who got kicked out of Central Asia by the Han dynasty. And it could be possible. Both the Huns and Magyars were nomadic horse riders from the Asian steppe. In later Hungarian historical chronicles like the Gesta Hungarorum claim that Attila and the Huns are national Hungarian ancestors. And I mean, Huns, Hungary, it all makes sense, right? Well, it's not so clear. Despite the similarities, historians and linguists believe that the Magyars are in fact not descended from the Huns, and are 2 distinct people groups, as the Magyars and Huns likely spoke quite different languages, and any histories linking the 2 groups, like the Gesta Hungarorum, are seen as purely mythological by scholars, as the author of this chronicle is unknown, and we're not sure if claiming Hungarians are kin with the Huns was some sort of oral tradition or folk story, or if it was the author just bullshitting, because linking Hungary to a notoriously vicious warrior people who struck fear into the hearts of empires will make them appear stronger and much more fearsome as an ethnic group. So we're left without a concrete link between the 2 groups, and if we can't link the Magyars to the Huns, then linking the Magyars to the Xiongnu becomes even more difficult to prove, as the language the Xiongnu spoke has been lost to time, which makes any linguistic link between the Xiongnu and Magyars damn near impossible. Although, Genetic studies have found that the Magyars do indeed have some Asiatic steppe ancestry, but the link to the Xiongnu's themselves is distant, to say the least. So it's possible some Xiongnu may have integrated and genetically contributed to Central Asian populations that will later go on to become the Huns and perhaps the Magyars that later arrived in Europe in the mid to late first millennium. But it's far from confirmed, and the links are distant and ancient, and we've yet to see any real solid linguistic, historical, and archaeological evidence of Xiongnu directly turning into Huns or Magyars, and later, Hungarians. Jade Suit Life Support System. This refers to the practice of jade suit burials during the Han Dynasty. As we all know, nobody loves jade more than China. That tough yet beautifully green gemstone has been used for jewelry, weapons, tools, art, and more for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. The ancient Chinese believing that on top of just being a cool looking rock, jade also had some innate magical properties of virtue, purity, and most importantly, immortality. Specifically, the ability to perpetually preserve dead bodies, as Jin Dynasty Taoist physician Gi Hong proposes. If jade were to be inserted into the 9 orifices, which are of course your mouth, eyes, nostrils, ears, butt, and pee hole, complete with jade butt plugs and sounders and all, then the body would be preserved from decay and be put into a state of pseudo-immortality. And based on this belief, wealthy Han nobles that could afford the large amounts of jade required would commission entire body suits of jade to be made for them to be buried in. These suits being very intricately crafted, made of thousands of individual square jade pieces sewn together with copper, silk, silver, or even gold wire, to let everyone in the district know that you're dying rich and your body is never gonna rot. However, when the Han Dynasty fell in 220 AD, many Han tombs were ransacked by grave robbers, hunting those jade suit grails for a huge payday on ancient Han Depop. And this tomb robbing was very prevalent in the chaotic years following the fall of the Han Dynasty, and most of the jade suits were looted and likely disassembled to be sold off, and their existence even fell into legend, as ancient records mentioned these jade burial suits, yet nobody could find any, thanks to widespread tomb raiding. And not a single suit was uncovered until all the way in 1968, when 2 complete jade burial suits were uncovered in Han-era tombs in Hebei, with several more suits being found afterwards since then. But, did the suits work? Were the bodies inside still preserved thanks to the immortal powers of jade? Well, shockingly, no, they didn't. And inside the suits were nothing but ancient, disintegrating skeletons. But maybe that skeletal dust had fused into the jade after all that time, preserving the bodily remains, but just not exactly in the way that these ancient nobles probably hoped for. And jade suit burials were eventually banned in the Three Kingdoms period, as a way to try and reduce incentives for grave robbing, as the possibility of tombs containing bodies wearing insanely expensive full-body jade suits was just simply too strong of an incentive to bust open graves. Figurism. Figurism was a Christian thought movement that appeared amongst Jesuit missionaries in China in the early 18th century, where they attempted to prove that ancient Chinese history and literature was perfectly in line with ancient Christian theology and biblical timelines. They believed that Chinese history had also started before Noah's Great Flood, in line with biblical history, and they also believed that after the flood, Noah's son Shem moved to the Far East, perhaps as far as China maybe? And brought with him the knowledge of Adam. And Jesuits also claimed that the ancient Chinese religion, from before the Shang dynasty and beyond, a religion that has now been mostly wholly lost, was actually strongly connected to ancient Judeo-Christian practices, with this ancient Christian knowledge finding its way into the ancient Chinese classic texts, specifically the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, an ancient Zhou dynasty era manual on how to perform divination rituals and interpret their meanings, which is usually done by manipulating yarrow stalks in a way that I fail to really understand in my puny Westoid brain, where you create sets of quote-unquote random numbers ranging from 6 to 9 with the stalks, which represent either old or young yin and yangs, old meaning changing, and young meaning static, with each set created corresponding to one of 64 possible hexagrams in the I Ching, which are just combinations of 2 trigrams, which are the combinations of 3 yin and yang stacked up, solid lines representing yang, while a broken line represents yin, and each combination symbolizes the 8 fundamental phenomena on Earth: fire, wind, water, mountain, lake, and heaven. And once you create your hexagrams, you then look them up in the I Ching and interpret its hopefully auspicious meanings from there. The I Ching is highly revered for its status as the oldest of the 5 Chinese classics, and traditional Chinese belief holds that Fuxi, the brother of the goddess Nuwa and the creator of humanity, music, hunting, fishing, animal domestication, cooking and writing, and is often depicted with a serpent's body, is traditionally credited with discovering the trigrams and their representations, and traditional belief holds that he may have even wrote the I Ching himself. However, figurists believe that the I Ching actually contained the mysteries and prophecies of Christianity and was actually a secret Judeo-Christian text, and that Fuxi was actually the biblical patriarch Enoch himself, and had left ancient antediluvian Judeo-Christian knowledge and revelations of the I Ching and its trigram and hexagram figures, that even predicted Jesus' coming through its hexagrams and commentaries. Somehow. Basically, Figurism attempted to reconcile the massive differences between Eastern and Western religious practices by claiming that the Chinese and European Christians actually have a shared ancient biblical history, religious tradition, and rituals, and converting the Chinese population to Christianity could go over much more smoothly if they were aware of this little fact. However, Figurism ended up not really catching on. In fact, the Figurists ended up getting spit roasted, as they pissed off both the Chinese and the European Christians, as the Chinese weren't happy that their traditional histories and beliefs were being denied and revised in favor of this foreign god that they had no widespread belief in or no real connection to, along with a general rising of anti-Western sentiment among the Chinese elites and literati at the time. And the Europeans weren't happy that these heretical Chinese classical texts on how to perform curious divination rituals were being elevated to positions of importance in Christian faith, as well as other controversies over whether or not to accept traditional Chinese rituals venerating ancestors and mythical historical figures like Confucius into Christian faith that strained tensions between the East and West, which led to, quote, Chinese rites being completely banned in 1702 by Pope Clement XI, this ban not being lifted until 1939. This outright ban of traditional Chinese veneration rituals heavily discouraging any potential Chinese converts from accepting Big J into their life, as they'd have to give up their long-held traditional rituals and cultural beliefs to instead venerate this foreign messiah. In later Chinese persecution of Christians as they attempted to expel all forms of foreign influence from their nation had eventually caused Figurism to fade away and fall into historical obscurity. Han Purple. This refers to a man-made purple pigment invented in the ancient Western Zhou period of 1045 to 771 BC, and was used all the way up until the end of the Han Dynasty in 220 AD, known as Han Purple. It's known for its vibrancy and deep purple hue, and I mean, looks pretty good to me. I like purple. Looks good. Han Purple is made from barium copper silicate. It was used to paint wall murals, pottery, and even the terracotta army during the Qin dynasty, as the terracotta soldiers were all originally fully painted in various colors, but the ancient paint quickly disintegrated and faded to gray when the terracotta fellas were dug up and exposed to the raw earth atmosphere after a 2,000-year-long dirt nap. And Han Purple is pretty interesting, as usually, ancient pigments were made with naturally occurring colors, such as crushing red cochineal bugs to create red dyes and pigments. I love red 40. But purple was an exceedingly rare and expensive pigment at the time. So, the Chinese made their own synthetic purple pigment, the first of its kind in human history, in fact, by combining precisely measured amounts of barium, copper, quartz, and lead salt, which would then be combined and heated to a precise heating range of around 900 to 1,000 degrees Celsius, showing an impressively advanced understanding of chemistry for the time, as synthetic purple pigments didn't appear again until the 19th century AD, China getting like a 3,000-year head start on purple pigment production. They're just picking random stuff off the tech tree like pigments and wheelbarrows to use way earlier than everyone else. However, when the Han Dynasty fell in 220 AD and united China devolved into the warring and highly dramatized Three Kingdoms period, the usage of Han Purple suddenly stopped, and it appears that the formula and method for creating Han Purple was completely lost, and no records or instructions on how to make it survive the fall of the Han, making Han Purple some ancient lost media for millennia, all the way until the damn 1990s, when its chemical makeup was rediscovered while scientists were examining residue on the terracotta army statues. Not only that, scientists also discovered that Han Purple had some pretty intriguing properties to it. It was highly fluorescent when exposed to LED light, and it actually has quantum properties to it, as when exposed to borderline absolute zero temperatures in a high magnetic field, Han Purple's chemical structure reaches a, quote, quantum critical point, and enters a state of, quote, dimensional reduction, where its 3D magnetic behavior suddenly collapses into 2D behavior, which scientists are using to further research quantum mechanics and superconductors. And I'm not really sure what that all means, but it sounds like some real sci-fi shit. And it's really cool that there's an extremely advanced ancient Chinese synthetic color invented well over 2,000 years ago that we can still use to advance science even to this very day. Rural mystics and the Analects. I believe this refers to Book 18 of the Analects of Confucius, where Big C and his disciples run into several hermits and societal recluses, leading to some fairly odd interactions. Confucius first witnesses a man known as Jade, literally called the Madman of Chu, passing by while singing a song that goes, "Phoenix, Phoenix, how your virtue has declined. Your past cannot be corrected, but your future is yet to come. Give up, give up. Those who involve themselves in government now will be in danger." Confucius then hopped out of his traveling cart and attempted to speak with the man, but Jie ran away from Confucius, so he wasn't able to talk to him about his ominous song. And later on, Confucius sends his disciple Zhou to ask two locals for directions, and when the locals discovered Zhou was a disciple of the Confucius of Lu, one of them shouted out, "Disorder! Disorder throughout the realm, and who can change it? Rather than following a she who avoids people, you should follow one who escapes from the world." The man then went back to hoeing and refused to stop or speak to Zhou further, like an NPC who ran out of dialogue options. Zhou eventually fell behind Confucius's traveling group and ran into another old hermit man, asking him if he saw Big C pass by earlier, and the old hermit man then roasted Zhou for being a soft philosopher nerd, saying, "Your four limbs have not toiled, and you cannot distinguish among the 5 grains. Who is your master?" But it was chill, and Zhou then stayed overnight with the hermit man, and the man fed him chicken and millet, and he even met his 2 hermit sons. And Zhou left the next day and caught up with Confucius, and he relayed his experience with the man, and Confucius then sent him back to find the man again. But when Zhou went to look for him, the hermit man had completely disappeared. And Confucius also tells his students about 7 men who had abandoned society and their duties to live these hermitic lifestyles. And these odd interactions appear to be Confucian critique on early Taoist beliefs, as these hermits and reclusive men had become fed up with the disorder and danger of the Eastern Zhou period, a period defined by constant warring between feudal states, and they believed that attempting to engage in the current politics of the Eastern Zhou was pointless and even potentially immoral due to the widespread conflicts, and they had instead opted to live simple, moral, natural, and reclusive lives in nature. And while Confucius respects their moral convictions to try and seek their own way of truth, he also criticizes them for their choice to retreat from society entirely, as Confucius believed that any true gentleman still has a duty to society, and he must exercise his virtue while also contributing to it, working to restore righteous leadership through education and service, rather than quitting society altogether like these wayward goofballs. The 13th month on the Yueling calendar. This refers to the 6th chapter of the Chinese classic text, the Lingzhi, or the Book of Rites, which is titled Yueling, or Proceedings of Government in Different Months, and it's based on the lunar Chinese calendar, which is aligned with the phases of the moon, instead of being based on the Earth's orbit around the sun like our usual Gregorian calendar. And the Yueling isn't too concerned with pinpoint dating accuracy, and rather acts like a sort of heavenly version of those farmers' almanacs you see in grocery stores sometimes, where it highlights in each month the constellations present and their meanings, the changes in climate, behavior of animals and insects, what farming work should be done, what punishments should or shouldn't be given out, and what rituals and festivals both rulers and subjects ought to perform in each month. And by following the Yueling's guidelines, you'd be able to perform your daily work in auspicious harmony with the rhythm of the heavens and earth to bountiful results. However, like any good man-made calendar, it eventually falls out of sync with the Earth's true orbit and rotation, as a single Earth orbit isn't exactly 365 days long, and a single rotation of Earth's axis is just short of 24 hours long. And like our leap years, the Chinese lunar calendar eventually needs to be resynchronized with the solar year and the seasons, as lunar Chinese months are only 29 or 30 days long, and a whole lunar year adds up to roughly 354 days, a bit shy of that 365 and 1/4 day orbit. And when the calendars need to be realigned every 3 years or so, an unofficial 13th month, or an intercalary month, will be implemented, where it will repeat the last month's ordinances outlined in the Yueling and be given the same name as the last month, and no major rituals or festivals will be held due to the uncertain nature of this 13th month. And the Yueling calendar's commands and guidelines are sort of stuck in a limbo for a whole extra month until the calendar is back on track. The Yueling itself doesn't mention any 13th month, as to not disrupt the harmoniously clean nature of the 12-month lunar year, or the predictable stability in the yearly rhythm of the Yueling's guidelines. But when the 13th month needs to be implemented, basically, just repeat the last month's commands and guidelines until it's over. Guanyin is trans. Guanyin is the common Chinese name of, forgive me, I'm about to butcher this, Avalokitesvara, the Buddhist bodhisattva of compassion. In most forms of Buddhism, a bodhisattva is someone who is striving towards becoming a Buddha, a being that has achieved full enlightenment, but has chosen to intentionally delay their enlightenment to help others achieve Buddhahood through bestowing blessings, and some of these bodhisattvas live so many lives practicing Buddhism and striving towards enlightenment that they have become divine superhuman beings, essentially becoming minor gods that are prayed to, in order to receive blessings of compassion, health, and good fortune. Guanyin being one of the most favored and beloved bodhisattvas, due to her association with compassion and her ability to hear the cries of all people in the world, and is believed to tirelessly work to help all who pray out to her. Her most iconic depiction being the one with 1,000 arms coming out of her back, like in Hunter x Hunter. However, Guanyin has a pretty interesting history, and her physical characteristics have changed quite dramatically over time. As originally, when Buddhism first arrived in China in the Han Dynasty era in the 1st century, these early texts and depictions of Avalokitesvara, later Guanyin, had usually depicted him as a male, who was usually sporting a mustache and a loose, chest-exposing robe. However, as the centuries rolled on, Chinese Buddhists started depicting Guanyin with softer, less masculine features, and around the 12th century, Guanyin started to be depicted as fully female, wearing modest, non-chest-exposing robes, and given a motherly woman's face, and oftentimes even being depicted with an infant, to further drive the motherly aspect home, which is reflective of Guanyin's merciful and compassionate nature, which is heavily associated with ideals of motherhood in Chinese culture. Now, it seems like Guanyin had a several centuries long transition from mustachioed man to motherly maiden, but the thing about bodhisattvas is that they have the ability to manifest on Earth in any form that they see fit, whether that be male or female, as children or as old-ass men, or even as non-human entities like animals or spirits. In early texts on Guanyin, like the Lotus Sutra, describe 33 different forms Guanyin can manifest into, and ultimately, the essences of bodhisattvas are beyond human concepts of gender and sex. And since Buddhists believe that ultimate reality is that of emptiness, they have no fixed self like a normal human does, and their depictions are usually just reflections of the cultural sensibilities of those who worship them, not a concrete declaration of their actual genders and sexes. Cubical Lingzhi Fungi. Now, I'm not sure what cubical means in this context, but I believe this is in reference to the mushroom known as the Lingzhi, which means divine or miraculous mushroom, and is native to China and East Asia as a whole. And the Lingzhi has been prized for millennia for its applications in traditional Chinese medicine, as this mushroom is believed to have several beneficial health properties when consumed, such as boosting one's qi, calming the body and sharpening the mind, reducing inflammation and bodily pains, increasing physical energy and agility, and most importantly, extending life. Some TCM texts even claiming that when Lingzhi is consumed often enough, the years are lengthened to those of the immortal fairies. It's essentially a miracle medicinal fungus that can also reportedly make you immortal if you consume it often enough. And these mushrooms have been used in traditional Chinese medicine since at least 100 BC, and are usually consumed in the form of powders, teas, tinctures, tablets, and even coffee, as the actual shroom is too tough and bitter to eat raw. And Lingzhi's popularity in Chinese culture can be seen in how often it's depicted in Chinese classical imperial art, thanks to its status as a fairly common Taoist symbol of longevity, kind of like peaches, as well as a sign of nobility, as before widespread cultivation of the shroom, Lingzhi was pretty rare in nature, so usually, only the wealthy and the nobility would have access to the shroom of immortality, many Lingzhis being put into Chinese art pieces over the centuries, kind of like some auspicious hidden Mickeys. And Lingzhi consumption is still very popular to this day. Sales of Lingzhi products across the world adding up to a pretty juicy $2 billion industry of supplements and produce. But with our current modern science, technology, and knowledge, do we know if the Lingzhi bestows medical miracles on those who consume it? Well, scientists have done plenty of examinations and studies on the health benefits of the Lingzhi, and they have found that it can promote anti-inflammation, fortify the immune system, and act as an antioxidant to help cleanse the body. But it's far from a cure-all, and rigorous testing has had inconclusive results on some of the more fanciful health claims. I mean, we've still yet to confirm the existence of immortals who have gained their infinite lifespans from consuming lots of woody, bitter mushrooms. But like I said earlier, I'm still not sure what cubical means when it comes to these shrooms, so maybe that's the key to unlocking immortality with these guys. So if you know, please enlighten me in the comments. Legalist BDSM. Legalism was the state philosophy of the Qin dynasty of China, the first united Chinese dynasty, which in this context is mostly based on the writings and philosophies of 100 schools of thought philosopher Han Fei. Now, I couldn't find any ancient Chinese BDSM manuals or legalist-approved sex practices in my research, and Google probably thinks I'm fucking insane based on some of these searches I've made. So, I believe this entry refers to the fact that living under legalism is sort of like being in an abusive BDSM relationship with your emperor. But But if anyone knows if Han Fei or Qin Shi Huang were writing treatises on how to have proper legalist-approved sex or something, do let me know. Unlike Confucianism, that sees all humans as inherently good, and this goodness is exercised through righteous rule, filial piety, ceremonies, and social relationships, legalism, on the other hand, has a much more doomer outlook on humanity, and a far more Machiavellian outlook on how to rule properly. Legalism teaches that humans are naturally selfish, foolish, and short-sighted, and therefore, strictly defined laws, brutal punishments, and rule by fear was the only option to establish proper order in the chaotic times of the feudal Eastern Zhou period. Han Fei posits that power must be centralized around a single sovereign ruler, and all laws must be created in order to benefit his kingdom, and the power of the royal family members and court nobles must be heavily restricted, as to avoid court intrigue, political power struggles, and usurpations, and kind of like BDSM, where one person has total dominance over another, and can reward or punish them sexually for following or breaking a previously agreed upon set of rules, which also happens to involve some wacky-ass leather outfits and tying yourself up like a whale caught in a fishing net. But a huge aspect of legalism was how it handled rewards and punishments. Perform your professional duties in accordance with your job title and behave properly, and you'll be rewarded with money and prestige, and even land in some cases, as plots of land could be given out to commoners for volunteer service in the military. That's just one example. But commit a crime or step out of line, and the ruler and his officials had pretty much free reign to punish you in any way they deemed fit. And now that laws were standardized and circulated amongst all of Qin Shi Huang's empire, in order to prevent people from even thinking about breaking the law, and to compel them to work to further the goals of the emperor and the state, legalism made a big deal about displaying how horrifying these punishments could be, and brutal punishments were given out for all different types of crimes, which were on a spectrum of severity from simple fines to total familial exterminations. If the crime was minor, punishment would usually start with a fine, usually in the form of a tribute of armor or weapons to the Qin army. Next was social demotion and confiscation of property, or being beat with a stick. If the crime was a bit more severe, the accused may be pressed into hard labor or military service, and they were usually then sent out to the frontiers of the empire, building walls for Qin Shi Huang and fighting off frontier raiders. And if the crime was considered severe, the punishments would get comically brutal. It would start with branding, either with hot irons to the face or forced tattoos to permanently mark someone as a criminal, which would then upgrade to mutilation, where eyes, noses, ears, and feet could be chopped off or cut out, and the accused also may be castrated. And we then graduate to executions, which starts with simple beheadings, and then moves on to being fucking bisected at the waist, or having all your limbs tied to 4 horse-drawn chariots, who then tear your body to pieces by charging off in different directions. And for the worst of crimes, which was usually treason, entire communities and families could be killed off for the actions of a single person, regardless if they were actually guilty or not, which is known as the 9 familial exterminations, which included killing the accused's parents, their grandparents, their children, who were forced into slavery if they were too young, their children's spouses, their grandchildren, their siblings and in-laws, their aunts and uncles, their cousins, the accused spouse, their spouse's parents, and of course, the accused themselves. And this potential for entire families and communities to be wiped out for a single crime led to legalist society becoming very paranoid and self-surveilled, heavily incentivizing backstabbing and snitching on your friends and family, as community members had to spy on each other and report any potential criminal activity that they may witness, as failure to report crimes was considered a major crime in and of itself, which could lead to more severe punishments and executions. And despite legalism giving rise to the first truly unified dynasty of China through its strong centralized power structure, brutally efficient bureaucracy, standardizations, and harsh laws keeping populations under strict imperial control, legalism became widely hated by the Chinese populace, hated by both nobles and commoners alike. As for the common people, it created a society built on threats of fear and brutally violent punishments, which was enforced by widespread mistrust and paranoia towards their fellow community members. And as for the nobles, they were not given special treatment for their status. All people were equal in the eyes of the legalist law, in the sense that nobles wouldn't be spared being cut in half for their crimes and mistakes, and they could even be punished for the crimes of their servants, as failure to control your underlings was also considered a crime. Hell, the Han Dynasty even rose to power because its first emperor, a man named Liu Bang, had decided to rebel against the Qin after some prisoners he was transporting escaped. And the punishment for letting prisoners escape under your watch was, of course, death. So Liu Bang realized he could either turn himself in and die horribly, or take his chances with the prisoners and rebel, and maybe not die horribly if he played his cards right. And the Qin dynasty's central authority was crumbling after the death of old Qin Shi Huang, and choosing the latter turned out to be an excellent choice. And when the Qin dynasty fell and Liu Bang and his allies inherited the mandate of heaven, the overt, everyday brutality of legalism was then replaced with the softer, less scary moral virtues and righteous teachings of Confucianism as the new state philosophy under the succeeding Han dynasty. Although, many legalist bureaucratic practices and laws were still preserved into the future, like strong centralized power under a singular emperor, as once Qin Shi Huang conquered China and never truly went back to its more decentralized feudal system of the Eastern Zhou period and before. Well, not if they could help it at least, as imperial power did have eras where it was severely weakened and China devolved into feudal-esque nations, like the Three Kingdoms period and the Five Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. But punishments of forced labor and executions for breaking certain laws stayed on the books, as well as legalist systems of taxation, census taking, and standardizations were all kept by later dynasties, as despite legalism falling way out of social favor, their efficient bureaucratic institutions were still working quite well for the succeeding dynasties, and they could have a little legalism as a treat. 81. This refers to the fact that 81 is believed to be a very powerful number in Chinese numerology, especially in Taoist and traditional imperial beliefs. It is the squared value of 9, and 9 is the largest single-digit yang number, the supreme yang if you will. And 9 in Chinese, Jiu, sounds a lot like Jiu, which means long duration in time, which symbolizes longevity and eternity. And we can see this reverence for 9 in Chinese society reflected in weddings, as they're often scheduled to be on the 9th day of the month. 99 flowers are commonly given as wedding gifts, and September 9th is an extra auspicious day to get married on. The number 9 is also heavily associated with the Emperor of China himself, as before the imperial service exam was implemented, imperial officials were organized in a 9-rank system subordinate to the emperor, and the emperor also had 9 bestowments to give out as rewards for loyalty and duty. And of course, the 9 familial exterminations that the Qin were quite fond of, the ultimate punishment you could give a single man. And emperor robes usually depicted 9 dragons to symbolize the majesty, power, and hopeful longevity of the emperor. Therefore, if you square 9, you get the ultimate yang number of 81, and the longevity effects of 9 are extended to represent perfection, 81 being known as the perfect square. And how long is the Tao Te Ching? That's right, it's 81 chapters long. Also, in Journey to the West, the main characters of the story have to overcome 81 tribulations during their journey to the West to obtain Buddhist sutras from a real-life Buddha. The front gates of the Forbidden City have 81 nails, all laid out in 9x9 rows, and several other gate doors in the Forbidden City have 81 nails as well. And these are just a few examples. But reverence for 81 isn't purely traditional, and it extends into modern times. The official founding of the People's Liberation Army took place on August 1st, 1927. 8/1/1927. The standard issue rifle for the PLA in the 80s? It was the Chinese-made Type 81 rifle, first introduced in 1981. And there's a famous haunted house in Beijing named Xiongnu 81. And the number 81 makes plenty of other appearances in several auspicious forms all across Chinese history, from ancient to modern times. Qie represents a penis. This is the Chinese character of Qie, which means and, or moreover, or for the time being. And it may represent a penis. It kind of looks like one, I guess. It's got no balls, but the shaft is there, although it's oddly segmented into 3 blocks for some reason. I mean, it's phallic. Sure. I don't know. And nobody else seems to know for sure either. Seems to be a crass historical rumor. Let me know if I'm missing something here. Laozi became the Buddha. This refers to a traditional Chinese myth that Laozi, the old master himself and founding sage of Taoism, had somehow become the Buddha after he hopped on a water buffalo and rode out into the wilderness to live a simple life in perfect natural harmony with the Tao. But in these versions of the tale, Laozi didn't just retreat into the mountains to live a simple hermitic life, and rather, he kept traveling deep into the West, where he eventually reached modern-day India, where he may have then met and became the teacher of Siddhartha Gautama, who would then go on to famously found Buddhism and became the historical Buddha, as Laozi's sage wisdom and truth nukes that could make even men like Confucius quake in their boots had allowed Gautama to ascend to Buddhahood after learning about the universal Tao from the old master himself. And other legends go further with this idea and claim that Laozi had actually become the historical Buddha himself, becoming the first Buddha after he had traveled to India and then began teaching the people there about Taoism. However, the people misinterpreted his teachings, forming a unique version of Taoism, which then later became Buddhism from these misconstrued teachings, making Buddhism actually just a foreign reinterpretation of Taoism in the eyes of those who believe this story. Now, at least mythological date-wise, this could be possible, as traditional myths that mention Laozi living at the same time as Confucius usually have him dying sometime around 480 BC, and ancient accounts of Siddhartha Gautama's life have him dying around the same time, in 438 BC. So some timelines could line up if you believe in the traditional accounts and timelines. But much like the story of Laozi meeting Confucius, this was just a myth created later on for political and social reasons. But instead of trying to synergize two different belief systems together by having the two sages meet and then learn from each other, this is actually an example of Taoist propaganda, as it's attempting to reframe Buddhism as an offshoot of Taoism that was given to these Western barbarians by the legendary old master in order to temper their savage and immoral natures. However, the Taoists had this thrown back in their faces, as Buddhists created myths of their own that pulled a Mongolian reversal on these Taoist myths, and now claim that Laozi was actually a disciple of Siddhartha Gautama instead, and he had created Taoism as an offshoot of Buddhism, and he then went to China to convert the people to this new religion, even saying that Laozi was a bodhisattva himself, who had been sent to China on behalf of the Buddha to convert its people through a new religion that eventually became Taoism, and he returned to India once his work was complete, and that Confucius was also a bodhisattva himself too. And since Taoism and Buddhism were, and still are, quite large and popular in China, these stories of Buddhas and old masters and which religion is a ripoff of which shows us how these two religions clash for cultural and political dominance in Chinese history, these tensions sometimes coming to violent heads, like we see with Emperor Wuzhong of Tong's campaign of suppression against Buddhism, as Wuzhong was a devout Taoist himself, who launched his crackdown of Buddhism because he saw it as malicious foreign influence and a drain on resources. Buddhist temples and monasteries didn't have to pay taxes, you see. And we can see the foundations of these later brutal sentiments in these mythological stories of Laozi becoming the Buddha, and vice versa. However, we have to ask, is this story even true? Well, like the story of Laozi and Confucius meeting for the first time from earlier. Both Siddhartha Gautama and Laozi's lives are far more mythological than factual, as you first have to believe in the traditional accounts that place Laozi as a real person and a contemporary of Confucius and Gautama Buddha. Then you have to believe the stories of Laozi, equipped with nothing but his person and his water buffalo steed, had traveled all the way from China to India in the 5th century BC, at a time when traveling between the two nations was pretty much unheard of, and maps and safe roads between the two countries were non-existent, somehow braving thousands of miles of untamed mountains and wilderness, and found his way to India all by his lonesome is far-fetched to say the least. And making a claim that Laozi migrated from China all the way to India and then either taught or then became the Buddha himself would require plenty of corroborating historical accounts, traditions, legends, and archaeological evidence to prove, all of which we are severely lacking for these legendary stories. Interbellum Confucian Fascism. This refers to the political landscape of China in the interwar period from around 1918 to 1939, which was an incredibly interesting and chaotic time period for China. 2,000 years of imperial dynasties had ended in the Xinhai Revolution of 1911 to 1912, with nationalist leader Dr. Sun Yat-sen and General Yuan Shikai striking a deal to take joint power over this new dynasty-free Chinese nation. However, only a few short years later, Shikai, after staring at the empty imperial throne for months on end, decided, hey, I should be emperor actually, and he restored the monarchy, dissolved the National Assembly, and declared himself the Hongxian Emperor of China. But then the soldiers and people of China who had just spent the last several years deposing the Qing dynasty in bloody uprisings said, dude, what the fuck are you doing? Say psych right now or we're gonna rise up and put your head on a spike and chop your body up into bloody chunks. And Shikai, seeing how many scary armies were rising up to disembowel him, said, okay, my bad. Sorry guys. And he abdicated the throne only 83 days after declaring himself emperor, and then he promptly keeled over and died just a few short months later, leaving the central government crippled and ineffective, which gave rise to the infamous but extremely entertaining warlord era, where provinces were now under the command of local military commanders and warlords, who may or may not have been fully stable, like Zhang Zhongchang here, who treated his province like his personal flophouse, would shoot cannons at the open sky to try and attack the gods to make it rain, looted his province to fuel his gambling addictions, and would constantly boast about his dick size, giving himself the nickname 72 Cannon Chang in Old 86, because his member was allegedly as long as a stack of 86 silver coins. And I have a whole video on this guy's insane story if you want to learn more. It's not shit, I promise. I promise it's not shit. But anyway, Sun Yat-sen died in March of 1925, and he was succeeded by this handsome devil right here, as the new leader of the nationalist Kuomintang Party, a one Chiang Kai-shek, who led KMT forces in their campaign to subdue the warlords and reunite China in their massive northern expedition, which was completed in late December of 1928 and kicked off an era of KMT rule called the Nanjing Decade, named after their newly established capital, Nanjing, which is where we get into the meat of this entry. The KMT as it existed during this period could be seen as a fascist-esque government, as the KMT had single-party rule, Chiang Kai-shek wielded uncontested power as the military leader and ideological figurehead of the party, and he was also murderously anti-communist, betraying and purging them in brutal massacres during his military campaigns, and outlawing the Communist Party entirely during his rule. Military schools like Whampoa Military Academy were created to produce young officers who were wholly loyal to Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT, and we get extremely close to true fascism with groups like the Blue Shirt Society, a secret society of elite KMT ultra-nationalists who were directly inspired by the Nazi brown shirts and the Italian black shirts, who despised liberal democracy and saw violence as a necessary tool to purge their political oppositions. Many of the blue shirt ranks coming from graduates of Whampoa Military Academy. And Chiang Kai-shek also co-opted Confucian beliefs and ideals to promote his militaristic and conservative ideology through his New Life Movement social campaigns, as Confucianism on paper could lend itself quite well to certain aspects of fascism, as Confucianism is quite conservative in nature, and its deep respect for strictly defined hierarchy, proper ritual, and piety for your superiors could be harnessed to greatly benefit a right-wing authoritarian regime. And Chiang Kai-shek applied these Confucian virtues to try and mobilize the population to give up their vices, dress neatly, practice traditional behaviors of filial piety and respect for KMT authority, and attend nationalistic rallies to improve your moral hygiene, all to get the population on board with this new form of government. Chiang Kai-shek using Confucianism as a way to inspire nationalism, because it has been a moral authority in China for over 2,000 years, and he pointed to Confucianism as a superior form of morality when compared to the decadence of the West and Japan. But despite all these factors, it wouldn't be wholly correct to say that Chiang Kai-shek's KMT government was truly fascist, as it didn't have complete control over industry and populations, as China was still fairly ideologically and geographically fragmented, and the general population was nowhere near as fully militarized like in fascist Germany or Italy. And due to their hatred of Imperial Japan, the KMT was explicitly anti-imperialist. Also, the blue shirts, unlike the brown and black shirts, who were essentially a massive street gang of radicalized civilians whipped up into violent fascist zeal. The blue shirts were instead made up of almost solely KMT elites and officers, and acted as a sort of inner circle by and for the most loyal KMT officials, and their violent tactics were usually used on other political and military elites to beat or intimidate them into compliance, and the average Chinese person never really joined up with the blue shirts in any significant numbers. Also, the New Life movement ultimately failed, as it was seen as a confusing mess of an ideology by most, as not only did it try to use Confucian virtues, it also blended Methodist Christian virtues, as Chiang Kai-shek had converted to it in 1930, along with taking aspects of fascist and state capitalist ideas into one big, confusing, and abstract authoritarian ideology that the average person didn't really understand or know how to advocate for. And many saw using Confucianism as the moral bedrock of these new KMT-led movements as regressive and contradictory, as the KMT declared themselves as revolutionaries, yet used 2,000-year-old conservative imperial dogma to legitimize themselves. And many saw it as a return of the failed power structures of old that they fought for so long to end, which is in stark contrast to European fascism, which made a point out of throwing out long-held traditional beliefs in favor of new modern ideals, and not to mention all the world and civil wars coming to China soon, which put all these Changian nationalist social movements on indefinite hold. It's like when other Western political ideas are applied to Chinese society. It doesn't translate one-to-one, and usually ends up as a wholly unique ideology by the end. And I guess you could say it was fascism with Chinese characteristics, much like how current China is communism with Chinese characteristics. Four-eyed Songjie. This refers to Songjie, a legendary figure in ancient mythical Chinese history who was traditionally credited with inventing the Chinese character script and is the patron god of writing in China. According to legend, Songjie was the court historian and scribe of the legendary Yellow Emperor, or Huangdi, a mythical ancient Chinese king from even before the legendary times of Yu the Great and the Xia dynasty. The Yellow Emperor is venerated as the creator of many Chinese cultural staples, credited with the invention of Taoism, the Chinese lunar calendar, wood houses, boats, carts, bows and arrows, compass needles. His wife is credited with the creation of silk weaving, and more. Well, one day, the Yellow Emperor tasked Songjie with creating a writing system for his kingdoms, as the current writing system of rope tying, or quipu, wasn't cutting it. So Songjie set to work creating a new writing system, but he failed to create even a single character. The dude had the OG writer's block. Until either one of two things happened. One, Songjie saw a phoenix flying above him carrying a strange object. The phoenix then dragged it nearby, and Songjie found that it was a chunk of solidified mud with a hoof print on it that he couldn't recognize. And when he asked a passing hunter what animal the print belonged to, the hunter said that it belonged to a Pishu, a legendary winged lion-dragon hybrid beast that is a symbol of wealth and good fortune. Other stories claim that a curious tortoise came out of a nearby stream and sat near Songjie, and Songjie was enraptured by the flow of lines and patterns on its shell. But regardless, in both stories, Songjie then became filled with inspiration and a deep understanding of the natural world around him, and he began paying extremely close attention to the characteristics of all the things around him, and was in the flow state of making logographs until he had created a whole new writing system of characters to represent the world around him, and thus, the Chinese character writing system was born. An event so monumental, legends claim that when Songjie completed his work, the earth itself shook, and the gods and ghosts of the ancestors cried out at the new power the men of the earth had acquired, their tears turning into millet and grain as they fell from the sky. And also, you may have noticed that all depictions of Songjie show him with 4 eyes. These 4 eyes giving Songjie the power to see patterns and characteristics in the natural world around him that regular 2-eyed peons simply could not, making him the perfect person to create a nuanced and pictographic writing system that uses intricate characters to represent all things. Also, apparently, after Songjie had invented the character script, and this new writing system was spread all throughout the Yellow Emperor's domain, Songjie's legend and clout grew. His 4 eyes then gained the ability to see right from wrong and be able to tell truths from lies, somehow making him a living lie detector that could see into the underlying fabric of reality. Now, it's no surprise that the Chinese celebrate a figure like Songjie, as their writing system was one of the 4 original independent writing systems acknowledged by historians, and is the oldest one that's still in use to this very day, well over 3,000 years of using and developing the same language that doubles as both a communication device and as a calligraphic art form in an ancient, unbroken tradition. Also, Songjie's cultural fame can be seen in plenty of ways today. The earliest Chinese dictionary from 220 AD is called the Songjiepian, and the input method developed for writing Chinese characters with a standard keyboard is called the Songjie input method. And in 2004, a rock ridge on Mars was named after Songjie, and many monuments to Songjie exist in China, and he is celebrated every year on 420 during the Guyu festival. Nice. But with that, that's it for layer 3. You guys know the drill. If this does well, we'll go to part 3. And keep going on and on and on until I get no more views on this thing. But if you're still here, thank you very much for watching, and I love you all so much. Goodbye.